The city of São Paulo never truly slept, but its midnight hum was a lonely sound. Leo felt it vibrate through the thin mattress on the floor, a constant reminder of the relentless machine outside that had chewed him up and spit him out. He lay awake, listening to the soft, even breaths of his 7-year-old daughter, Mia, asleep beside him. Her small hand was curled near his chest, a fragile anchor in the suffocating darkness of their tiny, one-room apartment. A wave of nausea rolled in his stomach, a familiar mix of hunger and dread. The air was thick with the city's damp chill and the faint, sour smell of the garbage piled in the alley below. He closed his eyes, but the image of his wife's face, a year gone, was seared behind his eyelids. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, a hollow space that grief and now utter failure had carved out. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He was failing her. He was failing Mia. The thought was a physical weight, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. His gaze drifted to the small, rickety table against the wall. Even in the dim light filtering through the grimy window, he could see the stark red letters on the folded paper, the final eviction notice, 2 months behind. The landlord's words from yesterday echoed in his ears, cold and final. No more excuses. Leo. He felt a tremor in his hands. The same calloused hands that once effortlessly lifted steel beams and poured concrete, now unable to even provide a roof over his daughter's head. He had opened the rusted refrigerator earlier, a pointless, hopeful ritual. It was empty, save for half a carton of milk and a single withered lime. The hunger was a dull, constant pain in his gut, but the shame burned hotter. Mia had eaten the last of the bread for dinner, and she hadn't complained, but he saw the question in her eyes. He had failed the most basic duty of a father. The metallic taste of panic rose in his throat. The walls of the room seemed to be closing in, the city's endless noise a mocking laugh. A year. It had been just over a year since Maria was taken from them, a sudden fever that doctors couldn't stop. The construction site, with its loud noises and hard physical labor, had been his escape. He could pour his grief into the sweat, into the sheer exhaustion at the end of the day. It was how he coped. It was how he provided. But then the project ended. The layoffs came. He was just a number, a name on a list. Now, the silence was deafening. His hands, rough with the memory of work, felt useless and empty. He clenched them into fists, the knuckles white. He was a builder without a building, a provider without provision, a husband without a wife. He was just Leo, a 38-year-old man who had lost everything that defined him. The despair was a cold, heavy blanket, smothering the last embers of his spirit. He looked at Mia's sleeping form, her face so much like her mother's, and a silent, hot tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path through the grime on his cheek. He pushed himself up, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His bones ached. From the pocket of his worn-out jeans, he pulled out his entire worldly fortune. 3 crumpled bills of 100 Rs, $300. He smoothed them out on the table, next to the eviction notice. The paper felt flimsy, almost weightless, a pathetic shield against the catastrophe bearing down on them. 300 Rs. It wouldn't cover a week of rent. It wouldn't buy enough food to last until he could find another job. A miracle in this economy. It was nothing. It was the end. His stomach twisted into a painful knot. This was the bottom of the pit. He had dug through every option, called every old contact, swallowed his pride and asked for help until there was no one left to ask. The city, which had once promised a future, now only offered a dead end. The sound of a distant siren wailed through the night, a fitting soundtrack for his own personal emergency. He was trapped, a widower, a father, and a complete and total failure. And then, a thought surfaced from the murky depths of his memory, a forgotten inheritance from a great-uncle he'd never even met. It was a joke at the time of the reading, a piece of paper granting him ownership of a small, worthless plot of land somewhere in the arid, sun-scorched interior of Bahia. Terreno seco, the lawyer had called it, dry land. His family had laughed. What was a São Paulo construction worker going to do with a patch of dirt in the middle of nowhere? The deed was buried in a dusty box somewhere, a forgotten relic. But now, in the suffocating grip of desperation, the thought wasn't a joke. It was a splinter of light in the absolute darkness. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't hope. It was simply an elsewhere, a place that wasn't here, a place where the rent wasn't due, where the landlord couldn't throw them onto the street. It was a reckless, insane idea born of pure panic, but it was the only idea he had left. The cracked earth of Bahia. It was better than the cold pavement of São Paulo. It had to be. The decision was made not with a surge of courage, but with the quiet surrender of a drowning man. Leo carefully folded the 300 reais and tucked them into his pocket. It was the price of a ticket to nowhere, a final, desperate gamble. He looked at Mia, her innocent sleep a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. A cold resolve settled in his heart. The city had taken everything from him. It would not take his daughter. He began to pack, a grim, silent process. There wasn't much to take. A few changes of clothes, Mia's worn teddy bear, and the deed to the land, a brittle, yellow document that felt both like a lifeline and a fool's prophecy. Each item he placed in their single, battered suitcase felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the finality of their departure. The oppressive sound of São Paulo's midnight traffic seemed to fade, replaced by the frantic beating of his own heart. He was walking away from the only life he'd ever known, stepping into an unknown that terrified him more than any construction accident ever had. The bus station was a roaring beast of human desperation. The air was a suffocating cocktail of diesel fumes, cheap coffee, and stale sweat. The noise was a constant assault, the screech of brakes, the garbled announcements from a tinny speaker, the cries of vendors and the babble of 1,000 hurried conversations. Leo held Mia's hand tightly, his knuckles white. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and a child's adventure-fueled excitement. "Is this where the new house is, Papa?" she asked, her small voice nearly lost in the din. Leo felt a lump form in his throat. He forced a smile that felt like a grimace. "It's the start of the journey there." "My love," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. He bought the tickets, the exchange of his last money for 2 flimsy slips of paper, feeling like a sacrificial rite. He felt a profound sense of vertigo, as if the grimy floor of the station was tilting beneath his feet. He was truly untethered now, adrift with his daughter in a sea of strangers. The bus journey was a 2-day purgatory. The vehicle groaned and shuddered, a metal beast crawling across the vastness of Brazil. The cityscape of São Paulo, with its towering concrete and glass, slowly bled away, replaced by an endless, monotonous landscape of rolling hills and, eventually, the parched, thorny scrubland of the Sertão. The heat was a living entity inside the bus. It pressed in from the windows, radiated from the vinyl seats, and made the air thick and difficult to breathe. At night, a damp chill would seep in, but it brought no relief. Leo barely slept, his mind a relentless loop of what-ifs. What if the land was a myth? What if they couldn't survive? He felt Mia's small, warm body curled against him, a constant, precious weight. He watched her sleep, her face peaceful, and felt a surge of fierce, protective love that was so intense it was painful. This was for her. It had to work. He clung to that thought like a prayer, a fragile mantra against the rattling of the bus and the howling wind outside. The further they traveled, the more the hope he had carefully manufactured began to feel thin and brittle. The landscape grew harsher, the sun more unforgiving. The towns they passed through were smaller, poorer, the buildings weathered and sun-bleached. He saw faces etched with the same hardship he felt, people whose lives were a daily struggle against the dry, unforgiving earth. He felt his city-bred confidence, already eroded, crumble into dust. He was a builder of concrete towers, a man of steel and rebar. What did he know of this place? What did he know of coaxing life from cracked soil or finding water where there was none? The nausea returned, a cold knot of fear in his stomach. He would look at the deed, the elegant looping script promising him ownership of a piece of this brutal land, and a wave of doubt so powerful it made him dizzy would wash over him. He was a fool. A desperate fool who had dragged his daughter into a disaster of his own making. The hope wasn't just false. It was a cruel joke. Their final stop was not a town, but a dusty crossroads with a single, faded signpost. The air that hit them as they stepped off the final, rickety local bus was like a blast from an oven. It was a dry, searing heat that stole the moisture from his throat and made his eyes water. The silence was the next thing that struck him. It was a profound, ringing emptiness, broken only by the buzz of insects and the faint, whispery rustle of the dry vegetation in the hot wind. The bus drove away, kicking up a cloud of red dust that coated them, a gritty film on their skin and in their mouths. They were utterly alone. Leo felt a primal fear creep up his spine. This was an isolation he had never conceived of. The nearest village was miles away, a shimmer on the horizon. He adjusted the heavy suitcase, its handle digging into his palm, and took Mia's hand. Her small hand felt clammy in his. "We walk from here," he said, his voice sounding small and alien in the vast emptiness. The walk was a trek through a hostile world. The path was barely a path at all, just a faint track through thorny bushes and sun-baked, cracked earth that radiated heat. The sun was a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. Sweat poured down Leo's face, stinging his eyes. Every breath was a lungful of hot dust. Mia, brave and uncomplaining, began to stumble after the first mile, her small legs struggling to keep up. Leo's heart ached for her. He lifted her into his arms. Her weight added to the crushing burden of the suitcase and his own spiraling despair. The land was a palette of browns and greys, a dead landscape punctuated by skeletal trees and spiky cacti. There was no green, no sign of life beyond the lizards that skittered across the hot rocks. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for any sign of the shack, the small inheritance that was their last refuge. The hope he had nurtured on the long bus ride had completely evaporated, baked out of him by the relentless sun, and then he saw it. Perched on a slight, barren rise was the structure. His heart, which had been pounding with exertion and anxiety, seemed to stop altogether. It wasn't a house. It wasn't even a shack. It was a ruin, a skeleton. The hope that had died moments before was now stomped into the dust and desecrated. He slowly lowered Mia to the ground, his arms trembling. She looked from the ruin to her father's face, and for the first time, her own face crumpled with fear and disappointment. "Papai," she whispered, her voice trembling. Leo couldn't answer. He could only stare. The walls were crumbling adobe, with huge chunks missing, as if some giant had taken bites out of them. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, leaving a gaping hole to the unforgiving sky. There was no door, only a dark, rectangular void. This wasn't a new beginning. This was the grave of his last foolish hope. A bitter, choking laugh escaped his lips, a sound of pure hysteria in the crushing silence. He forced his legs to move, his feet dragging through the dust. The closer he got, the worse it was. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, of old dust and the faint, musty scent of animal droppings. It was the smell of utter abandonment. He stepped through the gaping doorway, his boots sinking into a floor made not of wood or concrete, but of the same packed, dry dirt as the ground outside. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom. He saw the flicker of movement in the corners, rats or lizards, scurrying away from their intrusion. A single, rickety chair with 3 legs leaned against a wall, the only piece of furniture. A cold dread, far deeper and more absolute than the fear he'd felt in São Paulo, enveloped him. This was not a shelter. This was a tomb. It offered no protection from the elements, no comfort, no safety. It was worse, so much worse, than the single room they had fled. At least there, they had 4 walls and a solid roof. He sank down onto the dirt floor, the suitcase slumping beside him. He pulled Mia close, her small body trembling against his. He had dragged her across a continent to this, to a pile of mud and sticks in the middle of a searing wasteland. The full weight of his failure crashed down on him, a physical blow that stole his breath. Tears of rage and despair welled in his eyes, hot and shameful. He had been so stupid, so blinded by desperation that he had imagined this terreno seco could be a sanctuary. He had pictured himself building a small, sturdy home, planting a garden, living a simple, dignified life with his daughter. The fantasy was so vivid in his mind that its collision with this brutal reality left him reeling. The silence of the place pressed in, a heavy, suffocating blanket. There was no hum of the city, no distant sirens, no human sounds at all. Just the wind whistling a mournful tune through the holes in the walls. It sounded like the world weeping for his foolishness. His throat was raw, parched from the dust and heat. Water. They needed water. He remembered the lawyer mentioning a communal well. He scanned the horizon from the doorway. A vast, empty expanse of brown. There was nothing. No sign of a well, no sign of any other human habitation. He was about to step outside to search when an old man, thin as a whip and burned dark by the sun, ambled past on a donkey. The man stopped, his gaze taking in Leo, Mia, and the ruin with an expression that wasn't surprise, but a kind of weary pity. "Newcomers," the old man stated, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "Looking for the well?" Leo nodded, unable to speak. The old man gestured with his chin towards the far-off heat shimmer. "It's 2 miles that way, but the water isn't free." A cold chill, completely at odds with the baking heat, ran down Leo's spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cracking. The old man's eyes were dark and knowing. "It's on Almeida's land. He controls it. Everyone pays." The old man's words were the final, brutal blow. Control, everyone pays. The 2 phrases echoed in the desolate silence long after the old man and his donkey had disappeared into the shimmering heat. Leo's last shred of agency, the fantasy that here, at least he would be his own master, dissolved into nothing. He had traded one landlord for another, one form of crushing dependency for a far more primitive and absolute one. He had no money to pay for water. He had nothing to offer, nothing to trade. He had led them into a trap, a place where the most essential element of life was a commodity controlled by a powerful, unseen figure. The isolation, the ruin, the heat, all of it paled in comparison to this new, suffocating reality. He felt a wave of dizziness and leaned against the crumbling adobe wall, the rough, sun-baked clay scraping his back. He was a prisoner of this land, a prisoner of his own catastrophic miscalculation. He looked at Mia, who was now sitting in the dirt, listlessly tracing patterns with her finger. She wasn't crying anymore. A quiet, terrifying resignation had settled on her small face. The sight broke something inside him. The fight, the desperate energy that had propelled him this far, simply drained away, leaving a hollow, aching void. His heart felt like a stone in his chest. He had failed her in the city, and now he had failed her even more spectacularly in the wilderness. He had promised her a new home, a safe place, and he had brought her to hell. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant, mocking shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it was an insult. As the shadows lengthened, the crumbling shack seemed to grow more menacing, the dark corners deeper and more threatening. A profound sense of being hunted settled over him. They were exposed, vulnerable, and utterly, hopelessly lost. The last of the light faded, plunging the world into an inky, star-filled blackness. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind began to howl through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the lonely, alien sounds of the desert night, the sounds of predators, the sounds of a world indifferent to their survival. Leo held Mia, wrapping her in his own jacket, trying to shield her from a cold that was more than just physical. It was the cold of absolute despair. His stomach ached with a hunger that was now matched by a soul-deep weariness. There was no escape. They couldn't go back. He had no money. They couldn't go forward. This place was a death sentence. He had hit the bottom in São Paulo, but he realized now that he had been wrong. The city was just the edge of the pit. This silent, desolate, thirsty land was the true bottom, a place where hope could not survive. Mia shivered in his arms and whispered, "I'm scared, Papai." Her words, small and fragile in the vast darkness, were like a knife in his gut. He held her tighter, his own body trembling. "I know, meu anjo, I know," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm here." But the words felt like a lie. He was here, yes, but he was useless. He was a protector who could not protect, a father who had led his child into mortal danger. He closed his eyes, the image of his wife's face returning to him, her expression not of love but of accusation. The weight on his chest was unbearable, a crushing physical pressure. He had run from his problems only to find bigger, more monstrous ones waiting. The feeling was no longer just failure. It was a deep, chilling certainty that he had made a fatal mistake, a mistake that might cost them everything. As he sat in the suffocating darkness of the ruined shack, listening to the wind and the skittering sounds of unseen creatures, a devastating thought took root in his mind. They were going to die here. They would die of thirst, or hunger, or exposure. They would vanish into the dust of this forgotten corner of the world, and no one would ever know. The city, for all its cruelty, was at least a place of witnesses. Here, there was nothing. Just the sun, the dust, and the oppressive, all-consuming silence. The despair was no longer a wave. It was an ocean. He was submerged in it, the pressure crushing him, the cold darkness filling his lungs. He held his daughter and waited for the sun to rise on the first day of their new, hopeless existence, feeling nothing but the cold, hard certainty of their doom. He had reached the bottom of the world, and there was nothing left. The second day dawned not with relief, but with a more potent, clarified despair. The sun climbed the sky with malevolent speed, turning the air inside the crumbling shack into a convection oven. Leo's skin felt tight, his throat like sandpaper. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a dull, crushing numbness. He sat in the sliver of shade offered by a half-standing wall, his mind a blank slate of hopelessness. How could he fix this? How could they survive? Mia, however, could not remain still. The stifling heat and the heavy silence of her father's grief drove her outside. With no toys, she created a world from sticks and stones, her small form a starkly vulnerable figure against the vast, hostile panorama of the Sertão. The dry wind whispered around her, a lonely sound that carried the scent of dust and heat. Her small games were a quiet act of defiance against the oppressive emptiness of their new reality. She wandered behind the skeletal remains of the shack, the only place that offered a slightly different view. A sliver of shadow clung to the base of the rear wall, a meager refuge from the sun's glare. She crouched down, tracing patterns in the dust. As her small hand swept across the ground, she stopped. Her fingers, accustomed to the baked, cracked texture of the earth, had brushed against something different. Puzzled, she pressed her palm flat against the spot. It was cool, not just shaded, but genuinely cool, and the dirt felt soft, almost damp, beneath her touch. It was a tiny island of sensation, completely alien to the hot, hard world around her. The coolness was a startling surprise, a secret the land was telling only to her. She felt a child's thrill of discovery, a secret whispered from the dust. Her curiosity, a bright spark in the bleak landscape, took over. She began to dig with her bare hands, her small fingers pushing into the strangely yielding earth. Dark, rich soil, the color of wet coffee grounds, clung to her skin, a stark contrast to the red dust everywhere else. A few inches down, her fingertips scraped against something hard, cold, and rough metal. It wasn't a rock. It had a strange, deliberate shape. Gripping it tightly, she pulled with all her might. With a soft sucking sound, the object came free from the ground. She held it in her palm, a T-shaped handle, caked in dirt and flakes of orange rust. It was heavy, solid, an old faucet handle, a spigot, abandoned here in the middle of nowhere, a tool for water where there was no water to be found. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her discovery like a pirate's jewel, and ran to her father. "Papai, Papai, look!" she yelled, her voice filled with an excitement that cut through Leo's stupor. She thrust the rusty handle towards him. "I found it, and the ground is cold there, Papai, it's wet." Leo looked up, his eyes dull with despair. He saw the rusty piece of junk in her hand and felt a pang of pity for her innocence. He started to dismiss it, to tell her to be careful with the old trash, but her words snagged in his mind. The ground is cold. It's wet. He looked from the spigot handle to the dark, damp soil caked on her small hands. A spigot handle, but no visible pipe. Cold earth in a land baked to the temperature of a kiln. A flicker of something, not hope, but a deep, primal curiosity stirred in the pit of his stomach. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints aching. He followed Mia to the spot behind the shack, his heavy boots crunching on the brittle, sun-scorched ground. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest. He pressed his own calloused palm against the patch of earth Mia had indicated. A jolt went through him. She was right. The difference was stunning, undeniable. The surrounding land was like brick, radiating heat that shimmered in the air. But this small circle of ground, no bigger than a dinner plate, was cool, soft, and unmistakably damp to the touch. It was impossible. He dug his fingers in, feeling the moist soil. Where was this water coming from? A deep shiver of intrigue, a feeling he thought had died in him, traced its way up his spine. The rusty spigot in his hand suddenly felt less like junk and more like a key. His mind, sluggish from heat and despair, began to race. Water. The word was a prayer, a hallucination, but this coolness was real. He had to know what was underneath. He looked around in a frenzy, searching for a tool. There was nothing. No shovel, no pickaxe, not even a trowel. His eyes scanned the debris around the shack and landed on a piece of timber that had fallen from the collapsed roof. It was long and heavy, and one end had splintered into a jagged, spade-like point. It was a pathetic tool, a glorified stick, but it was something. A surge of desperate purpose, the first he had felt in days, propelled him forward. He grabbed the heavy plank, the rough, splintered wood digging into his palms. For the first time since arriving, he had a mission, a single, tangible question that needed an answer. The work was brutal. He drove the splintered end of the timber into the damp earth, using his foot to force it down. He grunted with the effort, the wood scraping against his hands, raising blisters that quickly broke. The sun was a physical weight on his back, and sweat poured from him, stinging his eyes and soaking his shirt. But he didn't stop. The simple, mindless rhythm of the labor was a balm to his tormented soul. Dig, pry, lift, toss. Each shovelful of damp earth he threw aside was a small victory against the crushing inertia that had consumed him. The sound of his own ragged breaths and the scrape of wood on dirt were the only sounds in the world. Mia watched him, her earlier excitement replaced by a silent, wide-eyed awe. Her father, who had been a statue of sadness, was moving with a furious energy. He dug deeper, and the signs grew more promising. The soil changed from merely damp to properly wet, the color deepening to a rich old dark chocolate brown. It clung to his makeshift shovel, heavy and thick, and the smell. It was the scent of a forest floor after a rain, of deep earth, of coolness and life itself. It was a smell he hadn't even realized he was starving for, a scent that spoke of possibilities beyond the dust and decay. He was a foot down, then two. The hole grew wider, the pile of dark earth beside it a testament to his frantic effort. He was no longer a failed builder. He was an archaeologist, an explorer, unearthing a secret buried for generations. A frantic, wild hope began to bubble in his chest. Hot and fierce. Thud. The makeshift spade struck something solid. The impact jarred him to the bone, a deep, woody sound that was entirely different from hitting a rock. His heart slammed against his ribs. He dropped the heavy timber and fell to his knees, clawing at the remaining soil with his bare, bleeding hands. The dirt was cool and wet against his raw skin, but he didn't feel the pain. His focus was absolute. He felt the surface. It was wood, not a root, but flat, fitted planks. A structure, a lid, a massive, circular lid, at least 4 feet in diameter, its dark wood perfectly preserved by the damp earth that had entombed it. He frantically cleared the rest of the dirt away, revealing its full form, a sealed cover, a door to the underworld. A wave of stunned disbelief washed over him. Who would build this? And why hide it so completely? He jammed his raw fingers under the edge of the lid and pulled. It was immovable. The sheer weight of it, combined with decades of settled earth, held it fast. He felt a surge of desperate frustration. To come this far, to be so close, he refused to be defeated. He looked around and found a heavy, dense rock. Using it as a crude hammer, he began to pound at the seam where the lid met its frame. The sound was a series of dull, hollow booms that seemed to be swallowed by the vast, silent landscape. He hammered and hammered, his muscles screaming in protest. Fueled by pure adrenaline, he would not stop. He could not stop. He had to see what was inside. This was no longer about curiosity. It felt like a matter of life and death, a secret that was meant for him to find. With a loud crack, a section of the seam gave way. A puff of air, cool and smelling of stone and moss, escaped from the darkness below, a ghostly exhalation from the past. It was the smell of a cellar, of a cave. It was the smell of water. His heart hammered in his throat. He forced his bleeding fingers into the newly formed gap, the rough wood tearing at his skin. Ignoring the pain, he braced his feet and pulled, putting every ounce of his grief, his anger, and his desperation into a single inexplosive effort. The wood groaned, a deep, resonant sound of ancient fibers giving way. With a final splintering tear, half of the heavy lid shifted, and he was able to heave it back onto the surrounding dirt. It landed with a heavy, final thud that seemed to shake the very ground. Leo peered into the abyss. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a cellar or a simple cistern. It was a well, a perfect, deep, stone-lined well. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. Smooth, masterfully cut stones formed a perfect circle, descending into the darkness with a precision that belonged to a cathedral, not a crumbling shack in the desert. It was the work of a master, a builder like himself, but one who worked with stone instead of steel. This well was a monument, an act of profound intention and skill, hidden beneath the earth. It was completely at odds with the ruin above it, a secret of quality and permanence concealed by a facade of decay. Who would build such a thing, and then go to such lengths to erase its existence from the world? The question was as deep as the well itself. As his eyes adjusted to the subterranean gloom, he saw it, a faint glimmer 20 feet below. It was the surface of water, so still and clear that it perfectly reflected the small circle of sky above, a dark, liquid eye staring back at him. He couldn't reconcile the sight with the parched, cracked earth all around him. He fumbled for a small pebble and dropped it into the opening. He watched it fall, a tiny speck disappearing into the black. Seconds stretched into an eternity, and then he heard it. Plink. The sound was not the dull splash of a muddy pool, but a clear, ringing note, crisp and pure. It was the sound of life, the sound of salvation. A choked sob escaped his lips. They had water, an endless supply of clean, fresh, life-giving water. They would not die here. He sank back on his heels, his body trembling violently with a cocktail of exhaustion, relief, and euphoric shock. He pulled Mia close, burying his face in her hair. "We found it, Muanju," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We found water." After a long moment, as the trembling subsided and his breathing returned to normal, his gaze was drawn back into the well's mysterious depths. The initial, overwhelming relief gave way to a renewed sense of mystery. There was something else down there, something unnatural. A heavy, dark chain was bolted to the stone wall just below the surface, its rusted links disappearing into the clear water. His eyes followed the chain down to where it ended, tethered to a large, dark, rectangular object resting on the well's floor. His mind struggled to process the second impossibility, a well, expertly hidden, and now a heavy metal box, deliberately chained to the bottom. This was no ordinary well built for survival. This was a vault, a secret hiding place, designed to use the water itself as a lock and key, the spigot handle, the damp earth, the hidden lid. It was all a complex trail of breadcrumbs left by someone long ago, a desperate hope for discovery. Leo felt a profound connection to this unknown person, this fellow builder. He felt the weight of the story that was buried here, and a deep, unshakable conviction that he was the one who was meant to unearth it. The mystery of the water was solved, but a much deeper one had just opened up before him. A fresh surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through his exhaustion. He had to get that box. He examined the chain where it was bolted to the well's stone lining. The bolt was deep, but the links of the chain near it were thick with 50 years of rust. He found the heaviest rock he could lift, lay on his stomach, and leaned precariously over the dark opening. He began to smash the rock against the chain just below the bolt. The sharp clang of rock against metal echoed strangely in the well's shaft, a percussive and urgent sound. Sparks flew with each impact, momentarily illuminating the dark water and the submerged secret it held. He worked with a feverish intensity, his world narrowed to the rock, the chain, and the box waiting below. After a dozen punishing blows, a rusted link finally gave way with a sharp, satisfying crack. The chain slithered down the stone wall with a metallic hiss and disappeared, leaving the box resting free on the well floor. Now he had to retrieve it. He looked around and found a long, thick root snaking out from a nearby dead tree. With the small, worn pocket knife he always carried, he painstakingly carved a hook into one end. For what felt like an hour, he lay at the edge of the well, patiently fishing for the chain in the clear depths. Finally, the root hook caught. He tested the hold, then began to pull. The weight was immense, far heavier than he expected. He pulled hand over hand, his already raw palms screaming, the rusted chain links cutting into his flesh as he hauled the heavy secret from its watery grave. With a final, desperate heave that sent pain shooting through his back and arms, the box cleared the lip of the well. It landed on the dirt with a heavy, squelching thud. It was a military-style footlocker, made of thick gauge steel. Its original olive-green paint was mostly gone, flaked away to reveal large patches of deep orange rust. A heavy-duty latch was clamped shut, but instead of a keyhole, a massive, old-fashioned padlock was snapped through it, a silent, corroded sentinel. More importantly, he saw that the entire seam of the lid had been meticulously sealed with a thick, dark layer of hardened wax, brittle and cracked with age. It was a tomb, designed to be waterproof, to protect its contents from the very water that hid it. The ancient padlock was the final barrier. He didn't have a key, and he didn't have bolt cutters, but he had brute force and a heavy rock. He set the rock over the corroded shackle and began smashing it with another, smaller stone. The noise was deafening, a series of sharp metallic cracks that made Mia cover her ears. Again and again he struck, until finally, with a loud snap that echoed across the desolate landscape, the shackle broke. His hands were shaking, not just from effort, but from a profound sense of anticipation. He used his knife to pry and scrape away the brittle wax seal, which crumbled to dust. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the heavy steel lid. A musty, ancient smell billowed out, the scent of old leather, dry paper, and time itself. He stared down into the box, his heart pounding. There was no glittering gold, no stash of diamonds. The treasure was far more subtle and infinitely more intriguing. Lying on top, perfectly preserved, was a thick diary bound in dark, cracked leather. Its pages were yellowed with age, but they were dry and intact. Beneath it lay a neat bundle of documents, rolled and tied with a faded red ribbon, and at the very bottom was a stack of large, folded sheets of paper. They were maps. His fingers trembled as he carefully lifted the topmost map from the stack. It was a geological survey, rendered with the meticulous, elegant precision of a master draftsman. It was covered in handwritten notes, complex calculations, and strange symbols he didn't understand. He gently unrolled the bundle of documents tied with the ribbon. The top paper was brittle, its edges flaking. He recognized the formal, looping script at once. It was the original deed to the land, the very same property described in the document he carried, but this was the official registry from decades ago, issued in the name of Afonso Ribeiro, his great-uncle. A dizzying sense of history, of a story converging on him in this exact spot, washed over him. He carefully set the deed aside and unfolded one of the larger maps. It depicted the entire region, but it was overlaid with a complex web of contour lines, pressure notations, and cross-sections of geological strata. In the center of it all, corresponding exactly to the location of the shack, a vast area was shaded in blue. He scanned the map, his eyes tracing the shaded area. It was immense, stretching for miles in every direction, a huge underground formation, and scrawled across it in his great-uncle's neat scientific hand was a single, electrifying word: aquifero. An aquifer, not just a pocket of water, but a massive, high-pressure subterranean reservoir. An underground ocean of pure, fresh water, and he was sitting directly on top of it. Leo stared from the incredible map to the deep, clear well, and then back to the map. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't worthless terreno secco. It was one of the most valuable pieces of land in the entire country. The leather diary lay beside the maps, a silent invitation. It promised to tell the story of this discovery, and he felt a cold certainty that it would also explain why a man would hide a fortune instead of claiming it. With the sun beating down, baking the earth around him, Leo carefully opened the leather-bound diary. His hands, raw and bleeding from digging, trembled as he touched the brittle, yellowed pages. A musty scent, the perfume of sealed time, rose to meet him. A smell of old paper, dried ink, and forgotten secrets. The spine creaked in protest, a sound like an old man's sigh. He ran his thumb over the first page, feeling the indentations of the pen. The ghost of his great-uncle's hand. The script was a dense, elegant cursive, the meticulous handwriting of a man of science. Leo felt his heart begin to pound in his chest, a slow, heavy drumbeat. He wasn't just reading a book. He was communing with a ghost, a man whose life and death were inextricably tied to the very ground beneath his feet. He took a deep, shaky breath, the hot, dusty air filling his lungs, and began to read the story of the water. The first entries were filled with a palpable sense of academic excitement and wonder. The words painted a picture of a brilliant geologist, Afonso Ribeiro, consumed by a beautiful obsession. September 12, 1973, one entry read, "The pressure readings are consistent. The seismic data confirms it. It is not a pocket, not a stream. It is a sea, an entire ocean of fresh, pure water sealed beneath this cursed dry land for millennia. A gift from God." Leo, a builder who understood the joy of creating something from nothing, felt a profound connection to this man he'd never met. He could feel Afonso's intellectual triumph, the sheer elation of a discovery that could transform the entire region, turning desert into farmland, poverty into prosperity. The diary detailed the painstaking process of mapping the aquifer, the secret construction of the well as a private research station, a way to study the water without drawing attention. Leo felt a surge of pride. His blood, his family, had found this. It was a legacy not of ruin, but of genius. The diary's tone, however, began to shift subtly. The entries grew more cautious, the joy of discovery tainted by a new, creeping anxiety. October 5th, 1973. Coronel Almeida visited today. Leo's stomach tightened. Almeida, the name the old man at the crossroads had spoken. "He owns everything as far as the eye can see," Afonso wrote. "He came with a smile and a bottle of cachaça, asking about my prospecting." His eyes were not friendly. They were the eyes of a hawk, scanning the land for a rabbit, assessing its value, its weakness. Leo could feel his ancestors' unease, a cold dread seeping through the 50-year-old ink. It was the familiar feeling of a working man being sized up by a powerful predator, a dynamic Leo knew all too well from years on construction sites, dealing with wealthy developers who saw him as little more than a tool. The sense of a shared history, a shared struggle, made his knuckles turn white. The entries confirmed his fears. October 19, 1973. The coronel returned. He dispensed with the pleasantries. He offered to buy my land. The price was an insult, a pittance he would pay for a single head of cattle. He called it a gesture of neighborly goodwill. Leo could almost hear the man's condescending tone. "I refused," the diary continued. "I explained to him that the water below this land belongs to everyone, that my report to the government would ensure it is used to develop the entire region, not to enrich one man's private empire." He did not like that. The smile never reached his eyes. He said I was a fool, a naive idealist from the city who did not understand how things work here. A fierce pride swelled in Leo's chest. His great-uncle had been a man of integrity, a man who stood for something more than just profit. He had faced down a tyrant for the good of the people. The following pages were filled with a growing sense of dread. The entries became shorter, the handwriting more hurried. November 2nd, 1973. His men were here. They did not come to the house. I saw them from the ridge, surveying the boundaries of my land. They are watching me. A cold shiver traced a path down Leo's spine. The isolation of the shack, which had felt like a failure, now felt like a terrifying vulnerability. November 10th, 1973. The coronel came alone, after dark. No more smiles. He said the Sertão is a dangerous place. He spoke of geologists who get lost while prospecting. He said accidents happen when men are stubborn. Leo's blood ran cold. The threat was so clear, so direct. He instinctively looked over at Mia, who was now asleep in the shade, and a wave of protective fear, so intense it made him nauseous, washed over him. This wasn't just a story about land, it was a story about murder. He turned to the very last page. The ink was different here, rushed and slightly smudged, as if written in extreme haste. There was no date. "He knows I will not sell. He knows I have the maps. I have hidden the proof in the well, my only legacy. The water itself will be my witness. If you are reading this, it means I have failed to deliver my report. It means he has won for now. Do not let him win forever. Avenge me, avenge this land." The words hung in the silent air, a final, desperate plea from the grave. The diary was no longer just a historical document. It was a testament, a sacred charge passed directly to him. A profound, bone-deep anger began to smolder in Leo's heart, an anger on behalf of the brave man he never knew, a man silenced for his integrity. A silent vow formed in his soul. He would not let him win. The legacy of Afonso Ribeiro would not be buried in the dust. Just as the weight of that vow settled upon him, a new sound intruded, tearing through the profound desert silence. It was a low, powerful rumble, a noise so alien to this place that it felt like a violation. It was the sound of a modern, high-performance engine, growing steadily closer. Leo's head snapped up, every muscle in his body instantly tensing. His survival instincts, honed by years on dangerous construction sites, screamed a silent alarm. He felt his heart leap into his throat. He was no longer an archaeologist reading a story. He was a character in it, and the villain was approaching. He quickly and carefully placed the diary and the maps back into the metal box, his mind racing. He looked from the open well to the approaching sound, feeling trapped, exposed. The sound wasn't just an engine, it was the sound of power, of wealth, of a force that could crush him without a second thought. A great cloud of red dust boiled on the horizon, a signal of the intruder's aggressive approach. Moments later, a gleaming black truck, a late-model pickup so clean it seemed to absorb the light, barreled down the faint track towards the shack. It was a monstrous, arrogant machine, utterly out of place in this landscape of poverty and decay. It rolled to a stop a few yards from the ruin, its powerful engine idling with a contemptuous, throaty hum that was an assault on the quiet air. The dust it had kicked up slowly settled, coating everything in another fine layer of red grit. Leo stood, placing himself between the truck and Mia, his body a frail shield. He felt a primal sense of being hunted, the hunter having finally tracked him to his lair. The silence that fell after the engine cut off was heavier, more menacing than before. The driver's side door opened with a soft, expensive click. A man in his late 50s emerged, moving with an unhurried, proprietary grace. He was dressed in a crisp, white linen shirt and dark trousers, clothes that were ludicrously impractical for the Sertão, but broadcasted his status as a man who never had to touch the dirt. His shoes were polished leather, already scuffed with red dust. His hair was perfectly coiffed, silver at the temples, and his face was smooth, bearing the placid confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He wasn't the burly, intimidating figure of a coronel Leo might have imagined. He was something far more dangerous, a modern, sophisticated predator who wore his power like a tailored suit. He looked at the shack with open contempt before his eyes landed on Leo. The man walked towards them, his gaze cold and appraising. He moved like he owned the ground he walked on, which, Leo realized with a sickening lurch, he probably did. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes flicking from the crumbling adobe walls to the deep, open well, and then back to Leo. A thin, humorless smile touched his lips. He finally looked down at Mia, who was now awake and hiding behind Leo's legs, and the smile widened slightly, a chilling, predatory expression. "Ricardo Almeida," he announced, his voice smooth as silk but with an underlying edge of gravelly steel. "My father was Coronel Almeida. He used to own all of this, as far as the eye can see. I see you've finally come to claim your inheritance." The way he said the word made it sound like an infection. Almeida's gaze deliberately avoided the clear evidence of Leo's discovery. The well, the fresh water, the pile of damp earth. Instead, he gestured dismissively at the cracked, sun-baked ground around them. "This place," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "is worthless. It's a rock in the middle of a furnace. Nothing has ever grown here, and nothing ever will. It's a monument to failure." He paused, letting the insult hang in the hot, still air. "But," he continued, feigning a moment of thoughtful consideration, "I have a certain sentimental attachment to this region. I'll give you 10,000 reis for it. Cash." He patted a pocket on his crisp shirt. "It's far more than this patch of dust is worth, but it will be enough to get you and your little girl on a bus back to the city, back where you belong." 10,000 reis. The number was a shock and a sudden, tangible temptation. Just yesterday, that sum would have been a miracle, a lifeline that could have paid his rent, filled his refrigerator, and given him breathing room. It was an escape. A way out of this desolate hell. Leo felt a dizzying internal conflict. He could take the money, grab Mia, and disappear. He could forget the diary. Forget Afonso. Forget the violent history buried beneath his feet. But the last words from the diary echoed in his mind, a solemn command from the grave: do not let him win forever. He looked at Almeida's cold, expectant face, the face of a man used to getting his way. And then he looked at the well, the source of a secret fortune and a righteous cause. The 10,000 reais suddenly felt like 30 pieces of silver. Leo's throat was dry. He said nothing, his silence a sudden, unexpected act of defiance. Almeida's manufactured smile instantly vanished. The thin veneer of civility evaporated, and the true face of the man, hard, ruthless, and impatient, was revealed. A shadow fell across his features as his eyes narrowed. You should consider my generous offer very carefully, my friend, he said, and the word friend was a razor blade. His voice had dropped an octave, losing its silky quality and becoming a low, menacing purr that made the hairs on Leo's arms stand on end. The air, already thick with heat, suddenly became charged with an electric, palpable tension. Leo felt a cold bead of sweat trace a path down his spine. He instinctively took a half-step back, pulling Mia tighter against his leg. He was no longer in a negotiation, he was in a confrontation, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was utterly outmatched. The land baron took a deliberate step closer, invading Leo's personal space. His cold, dark eyes deliberately shifted from Leo's face and locked onto Mia. The little girl flinched, burying her face completely in her father's trousers. The move was calculated, a clear and brutal message. It is a very isolated place out here, Almeida continued, his voice a dangerously soft whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. Very lonely. A man with a child. He has so much to protect, doesn't he? So much to lose. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. Tragic accidents can happen to people who aren't careful, people who don't understand their place in the world. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked promise, a direct echo of the warning given to Afonso 50 years ago, a cycle of violence threatening to repeat itself. The threat hung in the scorching, silent air, a poisonous vapor. Long after the black truck had spun around and disappeared in its own arrogant cloud of dust, Leo stood frozen, his body rigid, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. He could still feel the chill of Almeida's gaze on his daughter, a violation that left him feeling sick to his stomach. In one hand, he clutched the heavy metal box containing his great-uncle's legacy, a call to arms from the past. In his mind, he saw the 10,000 reais, a ticket to safety and anonymity. The path to justice was a dark road guarded by a monster, while the path of surrender offered a quick escape from the immediate danger. The weight of his family's history and his daughter's entire future rested squarely on his shoulders. Here in this desolate wasteland, what would you do in his place? Would you take the money and run, securing your child's immediate safety? Or would you stay and fight for justice, risking everything against a man who holds all the power? The oppressive heat of the day finally broke, but the cool that swept across the desert brought no relief. It was a predatory cold, seeping into the crumbling adobe shack, making the shadows in the corners seem deeper, more menacing. Leo stood motionless, the metal box a cold, heavy weight in his hands. Almeida's threat was a living thing, coiling in the air around them, its venom seeping into his very bones. He felt a paralysis creeping over him, a crushing weight of indecision and terror. He looked at Mia, her small face pale in the twilight, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't comprehend, and his heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The vibrant, defiant anger he had felt while reading the diary had been extinguished, replaced by the primitive, all-consuming fear of a father protecting his young. He was trapped. The vast, open space of the Sertão suddenly felt more claustrophobic than any São Paulo apartment, a cage with no bars and no escape. The wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, a mournful, lonely sound that mimicked the howl of despair in his soul. Just as the last sliver of the sun vanished below the horizon, plunging the world into a profound star-pricked darkness, a new sound reached him. It was not the aggressive rumble of an engine, but something quieter, more organic. The soft, rhythmic shuffling of tired feet on dusty ground, accompanied by the occasional mournful bray of a donkey. A faint, flickering yellow light bobbed in the distance, slowly drawing nearer. Leo's body tensed, every muscle screaming with suspicion. He pulled Mia closer, his hand instinctively tightening on the cold steel of the box. But this approach felt different. It lacked the arrogant speed of Almeida's truck. It had the weary, patient rhythm of the land itself. The light grew steadily brighter, revealing a small, old-fashioned hurricane lamp held aloft in a trembling hand. The lamp cast long, dancing shadows, momentarily illuminating the figure of a man, thin as a desert shrub, leading a weary donkey. It was the old man from the crossroads, the one who had told him about the well. The old farmer stopped just outside the ring of gloom that surrounded the shack, his donkey sighing and dropping its head. He raised the lantern, its warm light spilling over his face. It was a landscape of deep ravines and sun-baked ridges, a face carved by 80 years of hardship under the unforgiving Bahian sun. But his eyes, which had previously held a look of weary pity, now shone with a different light. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a deep, ancient sorrow and a newfound, steely resolve. He looked from Leo's face to the terrified child hiding behind his legs, and finally to the heavy metal box clutched in Leo's hand. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of understanding that transcended words. "I saw the black truck leave," he said, his voice a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. "I knew he would come. Sooner or later, the vulture always returns to the carcass. My name is Jonas." His voice was low, but it carried an authority that cut through the whistling wind. He took a hesitant step closer, the lantern light painting the ruined walls in flickering shades of gold and black. "Forgive an old man's cowardice," Jonas continued, his gaze dropping to the dusty ground for a moment. "When you arrived, I was cold. It was the fear. For 50 years, that family's name has been a poison in the air of this place. We learned to look away, to keep our heads down, to pretend we do not see the snake in the dust. It is how we survive." He looked back up, his dark eyes locking onto Leo's. "But I saw the little one. I saw your face, and I saw the ghost of a good man, my friend Afonso, standing right where you are now. My silence has been a stone in my gut for half a century. Tonight, seeing that devil's son threaten another good man, the stone has become too heavy to carry." The confession hung in the cold night air, a heavy, tangible thing. Leo felt a shift in the world. He was no longer alone in this fight. He had an ally, a guardian of the story. "Afonso." Jonas's voice softened, a flicker of warmth in his raspy tone. He was not like the others from the city. He did not look at us like we were part of the dirt. He was a kind man. He described how he was just a boy then, 14 years old, working for his father on a neighboring patch of land. Afonso had hired him to help dig the well, paying him a fair wage, more money than he had ever seen. The geologist, seeing the boy's sharp curiosity, had done more than just pay him. "He taught me my letters," Jonas said, a profound sense of wonder still in his voice after all these years. "He used his maps and his diary to teach me how to read. He said knowledge was the only tool no one could ever take from you. He spoke of the water, not as a treasure to be hoarded, but as a gift that would make this whole valley green. He was a man of dreams." Leo listened, mesmerized, as the ghost of his great-uncle was given flesh and bone, transformed from a name in a diary into a man of kindness and vision. The warmth in Jonas's voice faded, replaced by a chilling shadow, and then the coronal began to circle, he whispered, his eyes darting into the darkness, as if the memory was a living predator. "I remember the night. There was no moon, a blackness so deep you could taste it. I was bringing a skin of water to Afonso late after my work. I was in the scrub, just over that ridge." He pointed a bony, trembling finger into the inky blackness. "I heard the truck, not like the one today, but an old Ford, rattling and coughing. It stopped here. 2 men got out. They were the coronel's men, his Kapangas. I knew their faces. I heard Afonso shout. There was a struggle, the sound of a body hitting the wall. I was so scared my teeth were chattering. I hid myself in a thorny bush, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. They were dragging him. He was not fighting anymore." Leo felt a cold sickness rise in his throat, the scene playing out in his mind with terrifying clarity. "They threw him in the back of the truck like a sack of grain," Jonas continued, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wide with the 50-year-old memory. "I was just a boy. I should have screamed, run for help, but there was no help to run to. The coronel was the law here. He was the judge and the executioner. To scream would have been to die with him. The shame and fear were still raw in his voice, an open wound that had never healed. But I did something else. I followed them. Leo's breath caught. Jonas described how he had crept after the truck's fading taillights, a small, terrified shadow moving through the desert night. The truck hadn't gone towards the main road or the village. It had turned off onto a barely there track that led deep into the Badlands, into a region of twisted canyons and rock formations that the locals called the Devil's Spine. The sound of the rattling Ford engine, the smell of its exhaust, the terror of that night, it was all etched into his memory. They stopped in a small, dead-end canyon, Jonas said, his voice cracking. I climbed the ridge above and watched. It was too dark to see everything, but I saw the glint of shovels in the faint starlight. I heard the scrape of metal on rock, the sound of digging. It did not take them long. He fell silent, the weight of the next words crushing him. They left him there. They buried my friend in an unmarked grave, in a place where no one would ever think to look. For 50 years, I have known. I have carried the map of that place in my head. I never told a soul. I was afraid for my family, for myself, but seeing you, seeing that child, the fear of my silence has finally become greater than my fear of the Almeidas. The revelation was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. The proof wasn't just in the box. It was buried in the desert, and this old man was the only living soul who knew where to find it. As the gravity of Jonas's confession settled over them, a new sound ripped through the night, shattering the fragile moment of connection, the deep, guttural roar of a powerful engine, returning. But this time it was faster, more aggressive, the sound of a predator that had finished circling and was now charging its prey. "They're back," Leo breathed, his blood turning to ice. Jonas's face, in which had been filled with the sorrow of the past, was instantly flooded with the terror of the present. "Inside, hide the girl," he hissed, pushing Leo towards the shack, but it was too late. A pair of blindingly bright headlights crested the small rise and pinned them against the crumbling wall of the shack. They were caught, exposed like nocturnal animals, frozen in a hunter's beam, the roar of the engine a physical blow against the silence. The truck skidded to a halt, its lights turning the small clearing into a stark, overlit stage, erasing all shadows, offering nowhere to hide. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. It was thick, heavy, and filled with violent potential. Two doors slammed shut in unison, a sound like a pair of gunshots echoing in the vast emptiness. Two figures detached themselves from the glare of the headlights. They were not the sophisticated Ricardo Almeida. These were different men, large and broad-shouldered, moving with a heavy, deliberate menace. They were silhouettes, their faces lost in the blinding backlight, which made them seem less like men and more like inhuman instruments of violence. Leo instinctively shoved Mia completely behind him, his body a trembling, inadequate shield. He could feel her small hands grabbing a fistful of his shirt, her knuckles pressed against his spine. The air grew thick and still, charged with the electric hum of imminent brutality. The moment stretched, each second a lifetime of dread. The two men did not speak. They did not rush forward. Their silence was a weapon in itself, designed to unnerve, to terrify. They split up, one moving to the left corner of the shack, the other to the right. Leo watched, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He heard a sloshing sound, the noise of liquid in a container. Then one of the men unscrewed a cap. A new smell cut through the clean, cold desert air, sharp, acrid, and chemical. It was a scent Leo knew from workshops and construction sites, a smell that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. Gasoline. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror crashed over him, so powerful it buckled his knees. This was not a warning. This was not a threat. This was the mechanism of their murder being laid out before their eyes. His mind flashed with images of fire, of smoke, of his daughter. A guttural, animal sound of protest was strangled in his throat. He watched in horror as the men began to methodically pour the gasoline onto the base of the old, dry adobe walls. The sound was a soft, steady splash, a sickeningly gentle sound for such a horrific act. The pungent stench of the fuel became overwhelming, an invisible poison that filled his lungs and made his stomach churn with nausea. The old timber frame of the roof, baked dry by 50 years of sun, would go up like a torch. The entire structure was a tinderbox, and they were dousing it with accelerant. Leo's mind went white with panic. All thought, all strategy, all anger vanished, replaced by a single, screaming instinct: protect Mia. He clutched the heavy metal box in one hand and held his daughter's head against his leg with the other, as if he could physically shield her from the horror of what was unfolding. The world had shrunk to this single, nightmarish scene, illuminated by the indifferent glare of the headlights. Jonas, frail and ancient, took a faltering step forward into the light. "Leave them be," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear. "They have done you no harm. This is between you and the ghosts you have made." The two men didn't even turn to look at him. They finished their task, tossing the empty plastic canisters aside. They clanged loudly on the rocky ground, the only sound in the charged silence. One of the men finally turned his head, his face still a featureless mask in the glare. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, as cold and dead as the desert stones. "The boss is a generous man. He is giving you a choice." The man's gaze was fixed on Leo, completely ignoring the old farmer. The words were calm, measured, which only made them more terrifying. They were the words of a man simply stating the terms of a job, a man for whom violence was a mundane transaction. "You have until sunrise," the man continued, his dead voice cutting through the gasoline-soaked air. "Sign the deed of sale. Leave it on that rock over there." He gestured with his chin towards a large, flat stone near the path. "When the sun comes up, we will come back for it. If the paper is there signed, you and the girl can walk away. We won't even look for you. The boss gets the land, you get your lives. It's a simple deal." The offer was laid out. A simple, brutal binary: submission or annihilation. Leo's mind reeled. The paper, the signature. It felt like signing his great-uncle's death warrant all over again, like validating the murder and the theft. It was an act of total capitulation, a betrayal of the vow he had made only an hour before. But the alternative was unthinkable, a vision of fire and screaming that made his blood run cold. "If the paper is not there," the man finished, his voice dropping slightly, carrying a chilling finality, "we will be back with a match." The three words hung in the air. With a match. There was no ambiguity, no room for negotiation. It was a clear, concise death sentence, a promise. The man held Leo's gaze for a long, silent moment, letting the full weight of the ultimatum sink in. Then, without another word, both men turned, walked back to the truck with the same unhurried, menacing gait, and climbed inside. The doors slammed shut. Another two cracks of a whip in the night. Leo stood frozen, his body trembling, his mind a maelstrom of terror and indecision. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. They weren't just going to kill him. They were going to leave him for hours to marinate in the terror of his own impending death. A psychological torture designed to break his will completely. The truck did not drive away. Instead, the engine remained off, but the headlights stayed on, bathing the gasoline-soaked shack in a relentless, unwavering glare. The two men were still inside, two dark shapes in the cab, watching, waiting. They had turned the clearing into a prison yard, with Leo, Mia, and Jonas as the condemned inmates. Every move they made was visible. Every whispered word felt like it was being overheard. They were trapped, not just by the threat of fire, but by the constant, unblinking surveillance of their would-be executioners. The psychological pressure was immense, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. The smell of gasoline was a constant reminder of their fragility, of how close they were to a horrific, agonizing end. Leo felt a wave of nausea and despair so profound he thought he might collapse. "They will do it," Jonas whispered, his voice trembling but laced with a grim certainty. He moved beside Leo, his old eyes fixed on the distant, silent truck. "I have seen what this family does to people who stand in their way. The coronel was a beast, but his son, Ricardo, is a snake. Colder. He doesn't kill with passion. He kills like he is signing a business ledger. There is no bargaining with a man like that. To him, your lives are just a minor expense to be cleared from the books." The old man's words stripped away any lingering, foolish hope that this was just a scare tactic. The danger was real, immediate, and absolute. The two men in the truck were not thugs. They were accountants of death, waiting to balance the books at sunrise. Leo looked down at Mia, her face buried in his leg, and a decision, born not of courage but of pure, parental terror, began to form in the chaos of his mind. There was no choice to be made. To stay was to die. To sign the paper was to condemn his soul and trust the word of a murderer, a guarantee that was worth less than the dust on his boots. There was only one path, as narrow and treacherous as a razor's edge: to run, to flee into the darkness and pray they could escape the monster before it decided to burn their world down. The thought was terrifying. They were on foot, with a child, in a hostile landscape they did not know. Their pursuers had a truck, a spotlight, and a complete lack of mercy. The odds were impossible, but impossible was better than the fiery certainty of staying. A frantic, desperate energy surged through Leo's veins, burning away the paralysis. It was the primal animal instinct of a creature fighting for its offspring's life. He crouched down, his voice a low, urgent whisper in Mia's ear. "Meu anjo, we have to play a game, a running game. We have to be very, very quiet and very, very fast. You have to hold on to Papai and not make a sound, okay?" She nodded against his chest, her small body trembling like a leaf. He didn't have time to comfort her, to explain. He could only act. He looked at Jonas, his eyes wild with desperation. "The light," he said, his voice hoarse. "The lamp in your window. Is it on?" Jonas nodded, his face a grim mask in the harsh glare of the headlights. "It will burn until the oil runs out. It is 2 miles into the northwest, through the worst of the scrub, but it is your only chance. Go now." Use the shadow of the shack. The old man's bravery was a small, steady flame in the suffocating darkness of the situation. Leo made his decision in a heartbeat. He clutched the heavy steel box, its weight a painful but necessary burden. It was their only weapon, the only proof of the crime, the only reason any of this was happening. To leave it behind would be to render Afonso's sacrifice and their own suffering utterly meaningless. He shifted its weight under one arm, the cold metal pressing against his ribs. Then, with his other arm, he scooped Mia up from the ground. She was surprisingly heavy, a dead weight of fear and exhaustion, but the surge of adrenaline gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, her hot, panicked breaths against his skin. He was ready. He took one last look at the silent truck, a mechanical beast waiting to pounce, and then turned his back on the light. Jonas grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong for such an old man. "Go," he hissed. "I will stay. I will walk out into the light, make a scene, distract them. It will only buy you a minute, maybe less, but it is all I have to give. Run and do not look back." Leo wanted to protest, to tell the old man to come with them, but he saw the unshakable resolve in Jonas's eyes. It was the look of a man atoning for 50 years of silence, a man making his final stand. There was no time to argue. Leo simply nodded, a gesture of gratitude so profound it felt like a prayer. He squeezed the old man's shoulder, then turned and plunged into the deep shadow cast by the rear of the shack, the only pocket of darkness in the overlit clearing. The first step into the unknown was a leap of faith into a black, terrifying void. The moment they were clear of the shack, the true nature of the desert at night revealed itself. It was not empty. It was a treacherous maze of unseen obstacles. The ground was a minefield of loose rocks that threatened to turn his ankle with every step. The air, which had seemed still, was a moving current of cold that bit at their exposed skin. He moved as quickly as he could, his feet crunching softly on the gravel, the sound deafeningly loud to his own ears. He could hear Mia's muffled sobs against his shoulder and the frantic, ragged sound of his own breathing. He scanned the horizon, his eyes straining against the blackness, and then he saw it, a tiny, impossibly distant flicker of yellow, Jonas's lamp. It was a pinprick of light in an ocean of darkness, a fragile beacon of hope. It seemed 100 miles away. He had made it perhaps 50 yards into the scrub when a shout echoed from behind them. "Jonas!" His old voice raised in a defiant cry. A beat later, the world erupted in noise. The roar of the truck's engine shattered the night, and a powerful spotlight beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the landscape in a wide, searching arc. The hunt had begun. Leo broke into a desperate, clumsy run, his heart hammering against his ribs. The beam swept past them. a phantom wall of white light, and then swung back. He ducked behind a large, thorny bush, pressing himself and Mia flat against the ground, his lungs burning. He could hear the truck's engine growling, closer now. They had taken the bait, but they were not fools. They knew he would run. The light was not a distraction. It was a tool for the hunt. The thorns of the bush dug into his back and arms, sharp points of pain that he barely registered. The spotlight's beam washed over their hiding place, the light so bright he could see the intricate patterns of the leaves just inches from his face. He held his breath, praying the bush was thick enough, praying they were invisible. He could feel Mia trembling violently, a continuous shudder that shook his own body. The beam lingered for an eternity, then moved on. He didn't wait. The moment the light passed, he was on his feet again, scrambling deeper into the darkness. The chase was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. Run, hide, run again. The sweeping beam of light was a constant threat, a blade that could expose them at any moment. He could no longer see Jonas's lamp. His world was a frantic, short-range battle for survival. The terrain grew worse. He was running through a dense thicket of spiny, skeletal vegetation the locals called caatinga. The thorns were like fishhooks, tearing at his jeans, ripping his shirt, and scratching long, bloody lines across his arms and face. He tried to shield Mia with his body, but he could feel her flinch as the sharp branches whipped against her. The heavy metal box banged against his side with every stride, an awkward, punishing weight that threw him off balance. More than once, his foot caught on a hidden root or rock, sending him stumbling, nearly falling. Each time, he recovered with a desperate, guttural grunt, his muscles screaming in protest, his only thought to keep moving forward, to put more distance between them and the roaring monster behind them. The sound of the truck grew louder, its engine a terrifying, constant roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was no longer on the track. The men were driving straight through the scrubland, crushing bushes and small trees in their path, a brutal, unstoppable force. The headlights bounced and swayed wildly, casting chaotic, dancing shadows all around them. It felt as if the entire desert was alive and closing in. Leo's lungs were on fire. A sharp stabbing pain had developed in his side. Every breath was a ragged, painful gasp. The adrenaline that had fueled his initial flight was beginning to wane, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He glanced up, searching desperately for the light. He saw it again, still impossibly far, but there, a promise. He fixed his eyes on it and ran. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. He pitched forward, crying out as he fell, twisting his body to land on his back and shoulder, desperately trying to shield Mia and the box from the impact. The air was knocked from his lungs in a painful whoosh. He lay there for a second, dazed, stars exploding behind his eyes. Mia let out a terrified wail, the first sound she had made since the chase began. "Shh, shh, meo anjo." "I'm okay," he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. The truck's engine sounded dangerously close. He had to get up. He had to keep going. He struggled to his feet, his ankles screaming in protest. He had twisted it in the fall. A searing pain shot up his leg with every step, but he ignored it, pushing the pain down, burying it under the overwhelming need to survive. He ran on, now with a pronounced, painful limp. The box felt like it was filled with lead, and Mia seemed to get heavier with every step. The spotlight swept over them again, and this time it hesitated. It locked onto their position, a triumphant shout carried from the truck. They were seen. They were exposed. There was nowhere left to hide. The truck's engine revved to a higher pitch, the sound of a predator closing in for the kill. Leo's heart seized in his chest. This was it. The chase was over. He looked wildly around, searching for any cover, any hope. There was nothing but low, thorny scrub for 100 yards in every direction. The distant light from Jonas's house seemed to mock him, a paradise he could see but would never reach. The headlights of the truck bore down on them, growing brighter, larger, consuming the world. The truck's headlights were like the eyes of a great beast, hypnotic and deadly. The engine roared, a promise of imminent, crushing impact. Leo braced himself, a strangled cry caught in his throat. But in their blind, arrogant rage, the henchmen didn't see what the desert had hidden, a deep, rain-carved fissure in the earth. The truck's front wheels plunged into the hidden ditch with a violent, metallic scream. The vehicle lurched to a halt, its engine revving uselessly, tires spinning and whining, flinging dirt and rocks into the night. It was a miracle. A few seconds of grace. It was all they needed. Fueled by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Leo scrambled the last few yards, his twisted ankle sending jolts of white-hot pain up his leg. He half fell, half threw himself and Mia through the open doorway of Jonas's small, lamplit home, collapsing onto the cool dirt floor as the door was bolted shut behind them. Safe. For a moment, they were safe. The sound of his own ragged, desperate gasps filled the tiny room, a frantic counterpoint to the frustrated roars of the engine outside. The tiny shack was an island of fragile sanity in a sea of chaos. Its single room smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and old books. Leo huddled on the floor, cradling a trembling Mia, his entire body shaking with the aftershocks of terror and exertion. Outside, the headlights of the trapped truck still swept back and forth, a predator's restless gaze, its engine intermittently revving in angry, impotent bursts. But inside, another sound dominated, the sharp, rhythmic crackle of an old shortwave radio. So Jonas sat hunched over the device, the glow of its dials illuminating his intense, focused expression. He spoke into a microphone in a low, urgent voice, the words spilling out in a torrent. He was telling the story, all of it. Afonso, the diary, the maps, the threats, the gasoline, the chase. A disembodied voice, tinny and laced with static, crackled back from the speaker. A lifeline stretching across hundreds of miles of darkness to a federal prosecutor's office in Salvador that never truly slept. An office that specialized in the ghosts of the dictatorship. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gold. The beautiful, silent arrival of the henchman's deadline. Leo stood by the small, grimy window, the heavy metal box at his feet, his heart a cold, hard knot of dread. He waited for the sound of footsteps, for the acrid smell of a lit match. Instead, a different sound came, a quiet, professional hum. Cresting the hill was not a man with a canister, but a convoy of 3 dark blue vehicles with official government plates, federal police. They moved with a silent, coordinated efficiency, surrounding the still-stuck black truck before the 2 bleary-eyed henchmen inside even knew what was happening. Leo watched, his breath caught in his throat. As agents in tactical vests moved in, there were no shouts, no struggle, just the quiet, authoritative click of handcuffs and the stunned, defeated expressions on the faces of men who had believed their power was absolute. Justice had arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of a page. Hours later, at a sprawling, opulent hacienda miles away, Ricardo Almeida sat on a pristine white veranda, sipping a small cup of dark, expensive coffee. The morning sun glinted off the turquoise water of his swimming pool, an obscene display of wealth in a thirsty land. He was scrolling through stock prices on a tablet, a picture of untouchable, modern power. He didn't even look up when the first federal vehicle rolled silently up his manicured driveway. Only when a dozen armed agents swarmed his veranda from all sides did he finally stand, his face a mask of confusion, then outrage. "Do you know who I am?" he sputtered. The classic cry of a man whose privilege had just slammed into a wall of unyielding law. The lead agent didn't answer. He simply produced a warrant and a pair of handcuffs. The soft, metallic click as they closed around Almeida's wrists was the sound of a 50-year debt finally coming due, a sound that echoed all the way from a forgotten grave in the desert. The next day, the desert itself was forced to give up its darkest secret. Led by Sue Jonas, who walked with a straightness in his back that hadn't been there for 50 years, a team of federal forensic experts made their way into the rocky labyrinth of the Devil's Spine. Jonas stopped, his eyes fixed on a patch of ground at the base of a uniquely twisted rock formation. "Here," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He is here." The work was slow, meticulous, and respectful. The dry earth was carefully brushed away, inch by inch. First, the rotted fragments of old clothing. Then, the undeniable, tragic discovery of human bones. They had found him. Afonso Ribeiro, geologist, visionary, and victim, was finally brought out of the darkness and into the light. Jonas knelt, placing a hand on the earth, a silent apology and farewell to the friend he had been forced to abandon. For Leo, watching this solemn scene, it was the moment his great-uncle ceased to be a ghost and became a man whose sacrifice now had a profound and lasting meaning. Weeks later, the world had changed. Leo sat not in a crumbling shack, but in a clean, cold, air-conditioned office in the state capital. The sounds of the city a muted hum outside the window. Across a polished desk, a federal prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s with tired but kind eyes, laid out the facts. The case was airtight. The diary, the authenticated maps, the discovery of Afonso's remains, and Jonas's unshakable eyewitness testimony had created a perfect chain of evidence. Ricardo Almeida was facing charges of conspiracy to commit murder, illegal appropriation of natural resources, and a litany of other crimes stretching back decades. "His empire is finished," the prosecutor said, her voice firm, "and your great-uncle's name will be officially cleared. More than that, his work will be honored. The aquifer he discovered will be designated a protected national resource. But the land, Mr. Ribeiro, the land and the primary access to that water is unequivocally yours." Leo stared at her, the words not quite registering. His land. He had come here seeking only to escape the streets, to find a patch of dirt to survive on. The prosecutor continued, her tone softening. "Furthermore, the state recognizes the grave historical injustice perpetrated against your family. A crime committed during the dictatorship, which resulted in the illegal monopolization of this water for 50 years. As the sole heir, you are entitled to compensation." She pushed a document across the desk, the preliminary settlement from the government for the historical damages and the value of the resource access rights is for 50 million reais. The number hung in the sterile air, an impossible astronomical figure. 50 million. He felt a wave of vertigo, his mind flashing back to the 3 crumpled 100 real notes on a table in São Paulo. It was not joy he felt, but a dizzying seismic shock, the ground beneath his entire life shifting in a single, earth-shattering moment. 6 months later, the land was unrecognizable. The ruin was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant, and sturdy home built of brick and wood, with wide windows that looked out over the valley. But the most significant change was the sound. The air, once filled with a crushing silence, now vibrated with the rhythmic, powerful thrum of heavy machinery. A massive, bright yellow drill rig stood like a modern monument on the very spot where Leo had dug with his bare hands. He stood a short distance away, holding Mia's hand. Her other hand clutched the old, rusty spigot handle she had found, now her most prized possession. The air no longer smelled of dust and decay. It smelled of diesel, ozone, and a deep, electric anticipation. The chugging of the rig was the sound of a new heart being installed in the dry land, a promise of the life that was about to be pumped through its veins. Leo held his breath, his eyes fixed on the towering derrick. Then it happened. The rhythmic chugging of the drill engine changed pitch, escalating to a high-pitched, straining whine, followed by a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. A moment of silence, and then, with an explosive, deafening roar, it came. A massive, powerful column of pure, crystal-clear water erupted from the borehole, shooting 100 feet into the sky. It was a liquid explosion of life, a triumphant shout from the earth. The water caught the brilliant afternoon sun, shattering the light into 1,000 dazzling diamonds and painting a perfect eke of vibrant rainbow against the vast blue sky. Mia gasped, then let out a peal of pure, unadulterated laughter, and, letting go of his hand, ran directly into the torrential spray, her arms outstretched. Leo watched her, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt a joy so pure and overwhelming that it brought him to his knees. He knelt in the rapidly darkening soil, the cool spray misting his face, and scooped up a handful of what was once red dust but was now rich, dark mud. He squeezed it in his fist, the water running through his fingers, feeling its life-giving coolness. This was real. This was his. He had not just found a fortune, he had unearthed a legacy. He had given a voice to a silenced man and brought a murderer to justice. The despair of São Paulo, the hunger, the fear, it all felt like a story from another man's life. He looked at Mia, dancing in the man-made rain, and knew that her future was no longer a question mark but a promise, an oasis built from the ruins of the past. Stories of redemption, of finding hope in the deepest darkness, remind us of the strength of the human spirit. If you believe that one person's courage can change the world and want to be inspired by more journeys from ruin to redemption, subscribe to our channel and join us for the next story.